Bonjour, hello, and welcome. Thanks for being here with us this afternoon. My name is Daniel Bélan, and I'm the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I'm joined by Frédéric Bastien, the director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship, and Allison Harell, co-director of the Consortium on Electoral Democracy. This event is co-organized by these three partners. I would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. It is important to us to recognize the importance of the land and the significance of the land on which we meet. Also, we want to acknowledge the complex web of relationships of which we are a part. We encourage everyone here today to seek out more spaces for learning and understanding the history of these territories. The McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, which is known as MISC, is the Center for Canadian, Quebec, and Indigenous Studies programs at McGill University. MISC supports a multidisciplinary approach to the study of Canada by bringing together students, researchers, and practitioners to discuss important issues about the country's past, present, and future. In addition to our academic programs, MISC also hosts public events such as today's panel on the Alberta election. You can learn more about our programming and about our institute at misc.ca/misc. McGill.ca/misc, M-I-S-C. To begin today, I would like to introduce Frédéric Bastien, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Montreal and is the director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship, one of our partners for this event today. Frédéric, c'est à toi.
Thank you, Daniel. It's always a pleasure for the CSDC to partner with the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada for events like this one. The Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship is an inter-university center funded by the provincial Fonds de recherche du Québec, Société et Culture, which celebrates this year its 15th anniversary. We are a team of about 40 faculty members across 10 Quebec universities. Our goals are to promote scientific research on democratic citizenship, to provide training opportunities for our graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, and to promote knowledge dissemination through events like this one. The CSDC is also proud to be an academic partner of the Consortium on Electoral Democracy, known as CEDEM, which conducts election surveys during Canadian federal and provincial elections across the country, including the current election in Alberta. My colleague Allison Harell is the co-director with Laura Stephenson at University of Western Ontario of this SHERC partnership project. As you may know, Allison is professor of political science at Université du Québec à Montréal, where she also holds a research chair on the political psychology of social solidarity. She is a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada. She is particularly interested to study the many ways social diversity impacts public opinion. She will introduce you to the participants to our roundtable, moderate the discussion, and take your questions as well. Allison?
Thank you, Frédéric, and thank you, Danielle, and all of the organizations that have been involved in organizing this today. I'm super excited to be here with the chance to speak to our three well-known experts that have been both following and studying Alberta elections, among many other things, for many years. So we have three panelists joining us today. today. I'm going to keep my introductions brief. The way this is going to go is that I'm going to introduce briefly and give the speaker's role over to our three panelists for a few minutes. And then we're going to have a discussion based on some questions that I've prepared in advance. As you would have seen in the chat, if you have questions along the way, please use the Q&A function that's just found at the bottom of your screen. You can post questions and then I'll read those out as we get to the more public Q&A later in our roundtable this afternoon, lunchtime for those in Alberta. So we have three distinguished panelists. We have Duane Bratt, who's a political science professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University. Lisa Young, who is a professor of political science at the University of Calgary, and Jared Wesley, who is a professor of political science at the University of Alberta. And what I'd like to do first is just give each of you a couple minutes to situate your own research and the things that you're really thinking about going into this the final few days of this election. So I'll start out by handing the speaker role over to Dr. Bratt.
Okay, thanks, Allison. And I am very pleased to be here and talking about the Alberta election, which I think affects not just Alberta, but obviously is of national importance. So I have been observing and studying Alberta politics for a couple decades now, probably most interestingly as co-editor of 2 volumes on Alberta politics, the Orange Chinook book, which looked at the Rachel Notley years, and Blue Storm, which also included contributions by Lisa Young and Jared Wesley that looked at the Jason Kenney years. And I really don't think you could look at the current election without understanding what happened to Jason Kenney. I will say that this is probably the most unique election that I have covered, and maybe the most unique election that Alberta has seen. We don't have close elections in this province. This will be a close election. You're having, for the second time in a couple election cycle, 2 women leaders. We have a current premier and a former premier going head to head. We're in a 2-party system. Which for those that like the Alberta Party or the Liberal Party are upset with there only being 2 parties, but the history of Alberta has largely been 1 party. So going from 1 to 2, I think is a big step forward. And while there's been a lot of issues that have shaped and changed over the campaign, I think the raw narrative has remained the same. The first is, if it wasn't for Danielle Smith, the UCP wins, I believe, a pretty easy re-election. Alberta remains a conservative province. From a partisan perspective, it's the default option out here, and the economy has rebounded. You given those 2 circumstances, if to borrow some of Jared's lines, if Joe Alberta or Joanne Alberta was leading the United Conservative Party, it's a pretty easy re-election. The only reason it's close is because of doubts about Danielle Smith's judgment, her competency, and her trust. And that remains a central pillar of the NDP campaign. In contrast, the Conservatives have spent almost like they're the opposition party. They're the challengers. They put so much emphasis on Rachel Notley's record as premier from 2015 to 2019. You would have thought that Notley is the incumbent government and that we just ignore what happened in the Jason Kenney years. And the other is the linkage that they're trying to make with Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh, who are not popular in Alberta, to Rachel Notley. There is a trope that has been going on right-wing social media that was amplified again by Danielle Smith in the debate, that somehow Jagmeet Singh is Rachel Notley's boss. It is untrue, but it's a powerful talking point, and people are already saying, well, if you like Trudeau, he's going to vote for Notley. Therefore, if you don't like Trudeau, vote for Smith. So those are the broad parameters of the campaign and kind of how I'm seeing things.
Thank you. I think we'll turn it over to Dr. Lisa Young for introductions.
Okay, thanks so much. In my career as a political scientist, among other things, I've studied party systems and I've studied gender and politics. And both of those, I think, come into play in a variety of ways in understanding the current Alberta election. And I think we'll have a chance to talk about some of that over the next hour. At a personal level, I really love badly written TV soap operas. And so where there are crazy plot twists and characters that do bizarre and irrational things. So really bringing together my political science and my personal love of things that are unbelievable, Alberta politics really is my sweet spot, because things happen that really seem highly improbable in Alberta politics, including, if we think back a year, the idea that someone who had largely disgraced themselves in Alberta politics, had crossed the floor as opposition leader to join the government, who had embraced a whole series of conspiracy theories about COVID, is now the premier and is favored to win. And I think every now and then we just need to take a moment and appreciate just how exceptional that is. I agree with a lot of what Duane said about the current election. A couple of things, though. I think there is a notion that if there were a different leader of the UCP, the race wouldn't be so close. And I think that's probably true. But it glosses over something that I think is an underlying factor in this election that's important to keep in mind. And that underlying factor is that Alberta is changing. And I see this election in some ways as being a conversation about leadership in exactly the ways that Duane was talking about. But underlying that, I think there's also a battle between two Albertas, an old Alberta of ranches, of oil rigs, the petroleum club, the ranchmen's club, these Calgary institutions, and a new Alberta that's emerging, that is urban, it's well-educated, and it is very ethnically diverse. And those two Albertas are sitting in increasing sort of confrontation with one another. And a lot of what's going on under the surface of this election, I think, is about that contest. I think this election also feels like such an important moment because one of the questions it seems to be asking is whether Alberta is going to lapse back into its pattern of being a single party dominant electoral system where we hold elections, but we know in advance who will be the winner, or if it is emerging into a competitive two-party system. And watching this election, I honestly don't know which of those two it's likely to be. But Jared is way smarter than I am, so I'm sure he will answer that.
That's a great segue to Dr. Jared Wesley. So the floor is yours, Jared.
Quite the opposite of what the UCP has been trying to do this campaign, which is to depress the expectations. So thanks for that one. Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm coming to you today from Treaty 6 territory, a little less smoky than the last few days, which is good news, I think, for everyone. I'm Jared Wesley. I'm the head of the Common Ground project here at the University of Alberta. I've been studying public opinion and political culture in this province really since 2005. And like the previous two speakers, got to say this election is a lot different than what we've seen in a lot of different ways. Our Common Ground project is designed to study the difference between who Albertans actually are in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of their personal attitudes, on one hand, and who Albertans see themselves to be. In other words, who Albertans think is the typical Albertan, as Duane mentioned, we use the moniker Joe to kind of capture that. And we've been doing focus groups and public opinion surveys since 2019 to try to get at that difference. And it matters a lot during election campaigns like this, because through our focus groups, we learn that most Albertans, regardless of where they're from, regardless of their background, tend to see the typical Albertan as being somebody who's from rural area, somebody who works in oil and gas or farming or ranching. They tend to be middle-aged, white, blue-collar men. And through that lens, we've been studying how Albertans think politics should be, because Joe Albertan's view of what politics is kind of sets the political culture, those underlying norms that dictate what's acceptable and what's feasible in our society. So in other words, most people call the provincial sales tax in Alberta the PST, which doesn't exist. They call it the political suicide tax, because anybody that proposes it would be seen as being fringe and not to be taken seriously. Well, that notion of a third rail or a political suicide tax really captures what we're trying to study. What are the guideposts for what's acceptable or feasible or desirable in Alberta politics? And this election is really bringing that to the fore, as Lisa mentioned. So one of the things we're going to be looking at is will the Alberta electorate look at the UCP's brand of politics as being commensurate with Alberta conservatism? And full disclosure, Ken Bosenpool and I wrote an op-ed on this in the Line that you can read. I land on one side of that debate quite firmly to say that the UCP's brand of politics is not conservative at all. It's more libertarian populist, and in many ways quite dangerous from a democratic perspective, given their, let's say, loose connection with the rule of law. So we'll be watching to see whether Albertans see the UCP's brand of politics is fitting into that broader conservative political culture that's dominated the province for over a century. But the next question is around not what's acceptable, but what's feasible. That's part of our political culture as well, not just here in Alberta, but elsewhere. And that tells us which actors are authentic, which actors have a chance of winning. And I'm interested to see where Albertans land on the question of whether the NDP is a mainstream, small p, progressive, small c conservative party. And the party itself has been trying to hone in on that message by garnering support from various former PC cabinet ministers and openly touting themselves as the inheritor to the Peter Lougheed progressive conservative tradition. To the extent that Albertans can get over the mental obstacle that is to vote for a new Democratic Party and to see that as being a feasible outcome, then I think the New Democrats have a chance. As I've written in my own Substack, everything seems to be lining up for the New Democrats in this election. They have the key ownership over key issues like healthcare and education. They have an advantage in leadership. Their ground game and get out the vote organization is much stronger in battleground places like Calgary. The big question is, will Albertans see them as a viable alternative to the progressive conservatism, or a viable brand of the progressive conservatism that they have supported in the past?
Thank you, Jared. So I'm just going to pull a few things from what each of you said. Duane said this was the, quote, most unique election. Lisa said highly improbable and exceptional. And Jared said a lot different than what we've seen in the past. So I'd like to hone in on the uniqueness of this election a little bit. What do you think is at the top of electors' minds this election? Is there something about this election, at least from the voters' side, that's really distinct? Maybe it's the branding or the attempts at branding. Maybe it's the uniqueness of the two leaders. What do you think is really driving the ways in which electors are reacting to this unique, highly improbable, exceptional, different election? Do you want to take it first, Jared?
Sure. I'll start with a little anecdote. I meet with organizers from various parties from time to time. And I remember about a year ago, I sat down with a conservative strategist and I asked them, what keeps you up at night as a conservative in Alberta? And his response was quite telling. He said, for the first time, it's become socially acceptable to have an NDP lawn sign in Calgary. Right? And this dovetails with what our Common Ground team is studying, which is political culture, the social acceptability, political correctness of doing certain things. And it's tough from a distance. I'm in Edmonton, where the election is effectively over in most ridings. Now that the polls have been open for 3 hours now, Edmonton's expected to be swept by the New Democrats. But to the extent that I'm looking at it as an outsider at the Calgary race, definitely the New Democrats have been doing a great job of marketing momentum, right? They have deliberately made this, the early part of the campaign, a contest over signage. And they have deliberately found influencers to amplify the message that people who have always voted Conservative their entire lives are now taking out a New Democrat membership. They're putting up signs. They're posing with dozens of people behind signs in places you'd have never seen 5 or 6 years ago. And in places, quite frankly, where conservatives, I'm going to say small c conservatives here, are openly vandalizing campaign signs, and the Democrats are mobilizing that as a show of force for them. To me, what's new is that we actually have the New Democrats being competitive, not just in Calgary, but in some of the smaller cities and some towns that we've never seen them competitive before. So in the aftermath of this election, if the New Democrats do not emerge victorious, the big question is, have they generated enough momentum to establish themselves as the alternative to government? Or will they erase all of those gains as people flock to another centrist or progressive party?
Mm-hmm.
So jumping on Jared's point, whether the NDP forms government or not, they will have a higher percentage of the vote than they've ever had before. They got about 41% when they formed government in 2015. They will surpass that this time. But if they don't form government, that will be seen as a loss given the opportunity that they have. But it will solidify, I think, Alberta as a two-party system. But I'm more interested on the United Conservative Party, which is not united and has not been united. This was a shotgun marriage between the Progressive Conservatives and Wildrose Party in the aftermath of their defeat to the NDP. The PCs governed for 44 years and then disappeared as a party. There is very little that connects the different components of the United Conservative Party together, except for hostility towards the NDP. That was the glue that formed them. That was the glue that existed in the 2019 election. That is the glue that's holding this fragile coalition together right now. But when this election is over, win or lose, the UCP is going to go back to warring amongst itself, because this is a merger of progressives, fiscal conservatives, social conservatives, urban, rural, moderates, revolutionaries. The very fact that you have candidates in Calgary door knocking saying, vote for the party, not the leader, because we will get rid of the leader when this election is over, is remarkable. Danielle Smith, in her post-debate scrum, was having to ask questions about her future as the leader of the party. This is the incumbent premier. This is someone who is leading in the polls, asking if she is going to survive after the election. You have this Take Back Alberta faction, which has essentially said, we are in charge of this party and Danielle Smith will do as we tell her to. And if she doesn't, we will replace her. This is all in the middle of an election campaign, right? And so win or lose, I think those wars go back again. And so say what you want about Rachel Notley and the NDP and their efforts to move to the center, they're still a unified party. They're still holding together. The UCP is not.
I agree 100% with both what Jared and Duane said. Maybe just by way of expanding on this a little bit, it's difficult to communicate to somebody outside the province the extent of intensity and anger in this election. And anger is driving both sides. Part of the reason that the NDP is able to mobilize in Calgary in the ways that it is because of anger that built up over 4 years of UCP government. I live, within walking distance of the university and a major hospital, and every NDP sign that I see also has public education sign beside it or healthcare sign. The attack on the public sector has generated this response, which is astonishing in Alberta, in the context of Alberta, because in the past, attacks on the public sector have just sort of been shrugged off. It's like, oh, it's Alberta, I guess they're going to kick us, right? But not now. So there's this mobilization. And then there's enormous anger at the rise of the NDP. And I think Duane mentioned Take Back Alberta. There is this notion that urban elites, non-whites, have stolen Alberta from the people who it should belong to. And so that is under the surface. And obviously there's a deep anger that is driving that. And so the stakes of this election just feel so very high because of all of that.
Could I follow up with you about that, Lisa? So, I mean, this is the impression as an outsider watching Alberta politics as well, is that there's a whole lot of hostility driving what's going on here. Do you have a sense of where that's coming from? Is it evolution over time? Is it something coming out of the pandemic? Is it, you know, the rise of populism in other countries that is being mobilized here by strategic actors? What do you think is driving that?
Yes, all of those things. I think it has been there in the first instance, right? If we talk about the Take Back Alberta group, certainly when the combination of threats to the Alberta way of life because of climate change and environmentalism and so on, that is the first threat. Then you add to it the election of an NDP government in 2015, which really started a movement that, you know, there are NDP cabinet ministers who had to have security and police at their constituency offices for the entire 4 years, right? So that's already been there. Add in the pandemic to take the heat up considerably, and it's many of the same individuals who are concerned. So the movement gains momentum. It's populism. You know, Jared writes about this and you know, can speak to it. So all of those things, and then add in the US and the role of non-traditional media. You know, Alberta has lots of people who get their news from Western Standard or the Rebel, and so that has a radicalizing influence. We have the highest level, according to ECOS, of disinformation of any province in Canada by a substantial margin. So all of those things, it's not everybody, but it's that segment of the population, and it's a bubbling cauldron of anger.
Mm-hmm. So I think
And that is playing itself out in the campaign. So, you know, we talked about the ethics investigation, where the ethics commissioner last Thursday said that Danielle Smith had violated conflict of interest guidelines by interfering in the judicial system on behalf of Art Plazowski. Art Plazowski is a street preacher in Calgary and is a horrible human being. This is a man who blamed the Calgary floods of 2013 on homosexuals, who refers to the police as Gestapo. And he gets an 11-minute phone call with Smith while she is premier, where she is defending him and sympathizing with him. And he is facing criminal charges for inciting violence at the Coutts blockade. Hours after getting off the phone with Plazowski, Smith then calls Tyler Shandro, the Minister of Justice, to appeal to the Justice Minister to intervene on Plazowski's case, right? And so this is pretty dangerous. Lisa mentioned the Take Back Alberta group, some of who participated in the Ottawa convoy, some who participated in Coutts, and whose key organizer and founder, David Parker, gave a speech where he said, you can elect socialists, but you have to fight your way with guns to get rid of them. You may recall in 1995 when the tanks were rolling through the streets of Toronto to replace Bob Rae, or the revolution in Alberta in 2019 to replace Rachel Notley. Of course, that's ridiculous, but he's making the comparisons to Cuba. And so there is an undercurrent of violence that is being mentioned much more openly now than it was ever before.
So maybe you can follow up a bit on that. I mean, there's been a lot of controversies during the campaign, but if you look at the polls, other than sort of one random poll where Notley was in the lead, it's been pretty stable. So there's been a lot going on, but at the same time, if you look at the polls over the last few weeks, 3-4 point lead for the UCP. Over the last week, it's been pretty solid 6-point lead. Are our electors already in their camps? Have they been there the whole time? Is there something going on that we're not picking up in these polls? So what are you reading with what's going on in the polls?
I'll start with that one, but I just do want to jump in and say we're all very engaged in this stuff in politics.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to make light of the violence. There was a tweet that circulated just yesterday with a pretty prominent conservative organizer calling for civil war. If the NDP loses, it's because they cheated, and we'll hunt them down, like using that kind of language. I don't mean to downplay that, but I also think it's important for us to take, the broader context into consideration. Most Albertans are not tuned into politics. I spent, as I said, over 2 decades studying this province. I can tell you that whether it's the mythical Joe Albertan or the median Alberta voter, they want to do anything they can to not think about politics. So most of them don't have time for any of this, and I'd be interested to see how much of them are actually paying attention to any of it because they're really averse to it. So, in terms of polls, though, I want to say first off, Allison, I'm on Allison's team studying this. We have a poll in the field right now. I have no access to that data. I'm not going to say, I can't say anything about it. But what I can say is having conversations with folks within both the New Democrats and the Conservative Party with access to internal polls, the internals look nothing like what you're seeing publicly. And there was one campaign event early that suggests to both camps that the momentum is solidly on the New Democrat side. And that moment was the release of a video where Danielle Smith was caught saying she won't wear a poppy, and she compared Albertans who got vaccinated to Hitler's followers. Since that time, it's not an exaggeration to say that night over night the UCP has been bleeding votes, and that's coming from both camps. And if you want evidence of that, the Premier herself had to spend 4 days defending her own riding in the beginning of this campaign. When's the last time you saw a Premier hunkered down in their own riding? This suggests that if a place like Medicine Hat is in play, my argument is if Medicine Hat is, then a place like Lethbridge, places like Red Deer are definitely in play as well. So I think we should all take these polls with a grain of salt and just consider them for what they are, which is part of the narrative, right? So the New Democrats have been saying we're 1 vote behind, we need to mobilize support, get out the votes, very important. And the Conservatives say everything's okay, take a deep breath, we're still winning. So that's the way I look at polls. It is so tight in many constituencies. It's going to come down to who turns out. And the stuff that we had studied going into this election suggests the New Democrats did, when this campaign started, have a huge motivation advantage. People want to go out and vote for them or vote against the UCP to a greater extent than vice versa.
Duane, is that how you're reading the election as well?
I think you need to understand the polling dynamic in this province, in that and it ties into the electoral map. So as Jared says, he's in Edmonton, that race has already been decided. There will be 19, more likely 20 out of 20 NDP seats Monday night. Then you've got the rest of Alberta, which is the small cities, Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, and rural communities, but also suburbs of Edmonton, suburbs of Calgary, like Sherwood Park and Cochrane. There's 41 seats there. The UCP will likely win 30 to 35 of those seats. That means coming to Calgary, where there are 26 seats, the UCP is going to have a 10 seat advantage walking in. So the polls matter, not province-wide, but they matter in Calgary. And here, if it's tied, that's a UCP victory. If it is a narrow UCP lead, that's a UCP victory. If it's a narrow NDP lead, that's a UCP victory. The NDP has to do very well in Calgary, better than it's ever done before, and win 18 to 20 seats in Calgary out of 26. To put this in context, when they formed government in 2015, with a lot of vote splits, they won 15 seats. They currently have 3 in the city of Calgary. They will win a lot more in Calgary, but they're going to have a pretty high bar. So the electoral map needs to be viewed in context with the polling numbers.
I would jump in and just add that one of the things that tends to matter a lot to Alberta voters is prosperity. And Jared has written about this. And so much as the people who have been following politics closely are tied up in knots about things that Danielle Smith has said about Take Back Alberta and so on, for the Albertan who's not following along closely and really wants government to continue to deliver the so-called Alberta advantage of low taxes and well-funded services, they can look at the UCP and see promises that will continue. And they are susceptible to the argument that Rachel Notley somehow managed to produce the economic circumstances when she was premier, although arguably a global drop in the price of oil might have also played a considerable role. But that argument matters to a lot of folks, and particularly we know there are gender differences in the issues that are priorities. The NDP has trouble with male voters, and I think that's a big part of the reason why.
So maybe we can follow up on the perceptions of these two leaders. I mean, a lot about what we know about party politics is they're very leader driven, and I think that's sort of the dynamics that we see in Alberta as well. In your opening remarks, everyone mentioned the leaders as important. It's kind of a unique election, as you pointed out. There's an incumbent premier who's a woman. We have the main competition who's not only a former premier, but also a woman. Are there specific gender dynamics going on here that you think help us interpret how Alberta electors are reacting to these two leaders, and also the images that these two leaders give to the two parties? Lisa, do you want to take that first?
Sure. And, for the political scientists in the audience, you've probably read, assigned to your students, Economic Man, Social Woman by Elizabeth Gedangle. And I think about it every single day in the context of this election. The NDP has great issue ownership and credibility around healthcare and education. The UCP has credibility and issue ownership around managing the economy. There is a persistent gender gap between the two, and guess what direction it is? Exactly as predicted.
Jared or Duane, do you have anything to add to that?
I want to talk about gender in slightly from a slightly different angle, because folks from outside the province may not have caught the transphobic remarks that were part of the campaign and formed, I would argue, a second major bozo eruption, as Tom Flanagan put it, during the campaign. So it was a campaign period video when one of the UCP candidates was running for the UCP nomination, I believe, and compared trans kids to pieces of human feces. It did get picked up by the mainstream media. We saw conservative commentators unable to run away from it. And it speaks to, and by the way, the UCP took 3 days to respond to it, and eventually said, if she wins, she won't be part of our caucus, at least not initially. People will remember about 10 years ago when we had a similar bozo eruption during that election, when one of the UCP or Conservative Party, Wild Rose candidates at the time, Wild Rose, I'm having a tough time keeping track of all of my Conservative parties here. Wild Rose candidate had made statements far in his past about members of the LGBTQ2+ community burning in a lake of fire. That one circulated on Twitter for a couple of days. Twitter was very early, in early days back then. And I remember Stephen Carter, who's a strategist out here in Alberta, made the comment, because he was running the Redford campaign at the time. We knew we had something when it made the jump from Twitter to Facebook. So there's a lot of stuff that happens on Twitter that remains under the surface. But as soon as that Lake of Fire comment started showing up in Facebook searches, that's when they knew they had something on their hands. And I have been doing some social media research during this campaign. It's not as methodical as in previous campaigns. We have seen the Poppy and Hitler comments and the transphobic comments make that leap from Twitter into Facebook. And to the extent that it dampens conservatives' willingness to vote, it will have an impact. I think a lot of people, when they look at two-party systems, just assume that in order to win, you need to convert people from one party to another. David Coletto's Abacus poll, that's what he said. You Democrats have got to convince 5 to 6% of people who have only ever voted conservative to vote for them this time around. Not really. You need to depress their will to vote. And it's comments like that that I think do make a difference for Albertans, because when we talk about Joe Albertan and how Joe looks at politics, Joe's not a social conservative. So these types of comments are not seen as being within the Alberta mainstream. It's not part of our Wild West mentality. It's unacceptable. And to the extent that Albertans are tuned in enough to make that judgment, they may not vote for the NDP, but they also may not vote for the United Conservatives.
So I think this question of mobilization is really interesting, and it's come up in a few of your comments so far. The other big issue, at least in certain areas, that could affect mobilization are the wildfires. So are they going to have any effect on either mobilizing people because they're angry about how things are being handled, or the proposals on the table for how they're being handled, or because there's actual issues with getting to the polls and feeling safe?
So the wildfires issue is one of those events in the middle of a campaign that could have had a dramatic change. Now that we're less than a week out, I don't think it has had that dramatic change. And that's because they're largely away from the population centers. This isn't like the Fort McMurray fire of a major city in flames, but it allowed for at least a short period of time Danielle Smith to move from leader of the United Conservative Party to premier of the province, to take on that mantle of premiership and the rallying around the flag, and to look authoritarian and bring Rachel Notley in as an advisor and look statesmanlike. It has hurt her, ironically, with her base in a couple of really intriguing ways that you wouldn't necessarily think of. So the first is, her initial communications was follow the rules, don't light campfires, don't use ATVs, evacuate if you're told to. Well, the freedom-loving anti-COVID people aren't going to appreciate that very much. And then much of her strategy, as I've said, is fighting Ottawa. Okay. Well, she's now had conciliatory phone calls with Justin Trudeau, called for federal assistance, bringing in firefighters from across the country. And so ironically, the things that she is doing well may actually hurt her with some of her own key supporters. And all of the conspiracies we've talked about, especially with alternative media, have jumped to the forefront. So the rebel is fixated that it's Trudeau's feminist firefighters that are at the problem here. The Western Standard is fixated that it's eco-terrorist union NDPers who are lighting fires across the province. This is a narrative that isn't going away. And so I think it highlights a lot of the pre-existing problems in the province.
Jared or Lisa, did you want to add anything in there?
I just add, yes, you can see the United Conservative campaign team really struggle whether to put Smith up in front of this in the beginning. Like, she made a few public statements to that effect. They actually invited Rachel Notley in for a photo op, at least, to talk about her experience in managing Fort McMurray fire as what seemed to be a rare show of bipartisanship. But since then, it's not an exaggeration to call Smith invisible on the campaign trail, right? So she's not. They've handed over all the comms on the wildfire situation to the wildfire officials. So that's who we see on our screens. We don't see her. She's tried to do some media avails and photo ops here in the Edmonton area, up in Sherwood Park, where the Conservatives hold the seat, and they're just drawing such small crowds that it's not worth putting the leader up there when you only see 20 people in the background. And you couple that with the fact that most reports that we're hearing about on the doors in Calgary is that local candidates are saying, don't vote for the leader, vote for the party. And if you have a problem with the leader, we'll get rid of her afterwards, which is part of the UCP branding, I think, now as a party. But no, it just suggests that, not that I wouldn't advocate we should ever play politics with a provincial state of emergency, which is what we're in right now. But Smith herself is so massively unpopular that they can't even make political hay out of that if they wanted to, right?
I'll just add one thing, and that is that for the past week, we have all been choking on the smoke from the wildfires. And the one thing that neither party has any interest in talking about in the context of this election is why Alberta is on fire in late May, and that is climate change. And, to the extent that, the carbon tax is a live issue and is, Rachel Notley is confronted with that, and she won't defend her own actions in the context of doing something about climate change.
Mm-hmm. So I see we're getting a few questions in the Q&A. I just want to encourage other participants, if you have questions, you can put them in there. I have 2 more questions to pose to the panelists, and then I'll start asking those questions. So please go ahead and make sure you post your questions as they come up based on the conversation we've had or topics that we haven't touched on yet. I wanted to shift the focus off of the parties and the competition between the parties and think more about the electoral process. So Elections Alberta has come under fire at various times during this election and previous elections. There's also the ethics probe release that we've already talked a bit about. How are these sorts of questions about the electoral process and electoral integrity more generally affecting how Albertans feel about democracy in Alberta right now? Are you sensing that there's confidence in the process? Is this sort of some of these questions pulling away people's sort of sense that going to the election poll is actually going to be counted fairly and the outcomes are going to reflect what voters want? Somebody want to take that first? I see Jared unmuted himself.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in because
Yeah, you've already attacked Elections Alberta, Jared, so you might as well do it here.
But it wasn't done lightly.
Yeah.
It absolutely was not done lightly. Anybody that knows me knows that I'm an institutionalist and want to preserve electoral institutions. But earlier on, Elections Alberta had suggested to folks, you need a voter ID in order to vote. So make sure you bring that to the voting stations. It's a good practice to bring ID, but it's not absolutely necessary. And we do know from research in the United States and some here in Canada that voter ID, the suggestion that you need voter ID may raise questions in people's minds as to whether they're eligible to vote. There are also questions as to whether you need to be on the voters list before you turn up to vote. To their credit, Elections Alberta has done a good job of switching their messaging to saying, make it easier on yourself and everybody else to bring ID if you have it. But I don't think that whole episode really brought into question the vote counting responsibility that Elections Alberta does have at the end of this campaign. That was until about a week and a half ago when we started to see leaked video of Take Back Alberta organizers holding late night webinars, training people to become scrutineers to challenge votes as they happen at voting places. And originally it wasn't a UCP run thing, then it was a TBA run thing, but we found through Press Progress's reporting that these webinars were being used to recruit people that were being sent to the UCP as volunteers. I worry about that, and I also worry about the clip that I'd mentioned, or the tweet that I mentioned earlier on about how people would look at a New Democratic victory as being evidence of cheating, because there's no way and otherwise that they could possibly win this election. I've been on a soapbox about this since well before the rise of Trump. Losers' consent forms the foundation of our democratic system. It's based on the notion that if you lose and election authorities say you lose, you're done, you concede and you move on and you give legitimacy to the next group. There are folks within the Take Back Alberta movement that do not believe in that, that are prepared to spread a big lie here, the way that it was done south of the border. And that really worries me, and is one of the reasons why I'm calling on everybody that'll listen to put pressure on their candidates to take that pledge, as basic as it is. Will you recognize the results of this election once they're certified? That's the point we're at in some of these constituencies.
And I would expand on what Jared was saying. This training of scrutineers, I think the use of the word scrutineer is pretty broad, because really what they're talking about is electoral security, and specifically warning them about busloads of people coming in. And they identify ethnic minorities and, of all people, Ukrainian refugees, that somehow, and there are a lot of Ukrainian refugees in Alberta, bear in mind, but there is an undercurrent where, and Daniel Smith got into trouble for this, of support for the Russians in the Ukraine war, despite the large Ukrainian population in Alberta. And that's being spread by right-wing media, which is very prominent here. So there are doubts being put on the electoral system, the likes of which we've never seen. This idea that you can't trust vote tabulators, that we need paper ballots. Well, we use paper ballots. These are voting machines that count, it's like those that count $20 bills, but that's not how it's portrayed. And you've got people largely on the right calling for them to be dismantled and crushed. So there is this undercurrent. I hope it doesn't come to pass with the election result, but it could.
I am worried about all of this. I won't repeat anything. I think if we do see the UCP win, it's not analogous to what we've heard about on the right, but I've already heard folks, NDP supporters, talking about, oh, how is it that you can win both the cities and not form government? So there's going to be focus on districting. And one of those facts to have in your back pocket is that the representation order that this election is going to be fought on was approved by the NDP. So but that's going to be an important back pocket fact for some of us in the days to come, depending on the outcome.
Yeah. So I have one more question, but I think I'm actually going to save my question for the end if there's time, because there's a lot of questions coming in from the audience. So there's quite a number of people who have asked questions around sort of the ways in which conspiracy theories might be mobilized, whether they're coming from external forces. So Dorothy Gale has a question, and apologies if I pronounce anyone's names incorrectly. How secure is the election process from political interference? But there are other questions there that are asking about sort of internal conspiracy theories as well as foreign interference. Are these really concerns in this election, and to what extent are they an issue that we should be worried about?
Well, CSIS reported that there were attempts in 2019 to influence the Alberta election through social media by foreign actors. But because it was such an overwhelming victory for the Conservatives, it was seen sort of as a trial run. There are an awful lot of bot accounts that are in play. Where are those originating? That's tough to say, but there clearly is elements of that. And a lot of the American influence has emerged into Alberta in particular, whether that was over COVID, whether that's some of the Trump ideas around elections being stolen, that is all incubating in this province and being spread by alternative media.
Jared or Lisa?
Yeah, I suppose the silver lining is that the Take Back Alberta folks have proven pretty poor at hiding things.
Yeah.
So a lot of these discussions are right out in the open. And I think that that makes it a little bit easier for those of us that are tracking it to tamp them down, but yeah.
I'll turn to another question from the audience to shift perspectives a little. So Nevin French asked the following question: when they lived in Alberta, there was always talk of a new centralist party. Has the NDP killed this off with the messaging of sort of a progressive conservative option? And what happens post Notley to the NDP if she's not in power? And they also say, hi, Jared. So, and I'm just going to read a second question because there's another question about the NDP as this new progressive conservative party by Olivier Jacques. How can the party move to the center like this? How can they continue to mobilize their base at the median voter if the base isn't socially democratic, like NDP branding is federally? So I'll kind of go around the table here. Maybe Lisa wants to jump in first, if you're feeling up to it.
Sure.
So is there a centrist option? Is it the NDP, or is there an option for a third party option to come up the middle?
One of the interesting things that's happened in Alberta politics since 2015 is that it was never clear what party was going to emerge as the party of the center or the center left. There was an Alberta Liberal Party that is sort of kind of around, but it had the Liberal Party branding, but it would win seats in Calgary for a while. There's the Alberta Party, which, certainly sees itself as a centrist alternative without the Liberal branding. It's been able to win, a seat here and there, but isn't sitting in the legislature right now. And because the NDP won in 2015, it gave them the opportunity to start to build a base for themselves as a province-wide party, or at least a party in Calgary as well as in Edmonton. They developed some roots in civil society by virtue of being the opposition party and the only other party in the legislature. They were the logical place for all of those people who were angry about what the UCP was doing to lend their support. And so it's really created no space for other parties, to the extent that there's a former leader of the Alberta Liberal Party who's issuing statements telling, if you're a Liberal, go vote NDP this time round. So that's really a difference. I think in terms of the base, folks who are true social democrats, the question is, where are they going to go? And because we're in this sort of high stakes two-party competition, there's a pretty clear understanding that if you decide that you're going to throw your support to the Green Party or to some other further left party, that's going to increase the odds that a conservative is elected. And so, Duverger's law is working nicely here.
Jared or Duane, do you want to add anything to that?
The only thing I would add is we did a Viewpoint Alberta survey in January of this year, and we asked people to check yes or no to a bunch of different political identifications, ranging from conservative, libertarian, and populist to centrist to moderate, progressive, and so on. And the results of that were actually fascinating to me. Yes, when we followed up the question, asked which one do you identify with primarily as the most important one? Conservatives make up about 37% of the Alberta electorate, but no fewer than 8 in 10 Albertans identify as both progressive and conservative. 44% of Albertans have identified themselves at least somewhat as conservative. 43% identify as progressive. Progressive is not a dirty word in Alberta anymore, considering that just about half of Albertans consider themselves to be progressive in one way or another. So you ask where's the center? Well, I don't think any party can hope to govern in a stable way, at least, without reaching out to that group that considers themselves to be both progressive and conservative. This is not the time to debate whether that's an oxymoron or not. But from an identity standpoint, it does make sense.
So Janet Brown, who's a very influential pollster, has been asking in her surveys for years for Albertans to place themselves on a left-right spectrum, 0 to 10. And she calls it her middle finger graph because year after year, the most #1 plurality is a 5, right smack dab in the middle. You average it out, it's slightly center-right, 5.5. But in a poll done in late April, they added a couple questions. They asked, and this was a Calgary-only poll, they said, place Rachel Notley on that spectrum and place Daniel Smith on that spectrum. And they had Rachel Notley at 3.8. That's a center-left party. When they were asked to place the UCP and Daniel Smith, they had it at 8 out of 10. That's pretty far right. And it's not just Albertans. Even when they broke it down by UCP supporter or NDP supporter, the result was the same. That more people believe that the UCP is much further to the right than where the NDP is. But the fact is, Albertans see themselves in the middle, and that neither of the two existing parties actually represent where they are, but they're mathematically closer to where the NDP is than the UCP. The question is, can they cross the Rubicon and go from being center right to center left, or center right to further right? And that's what this election is going to come down to.
Can I just add, because we did a follow-up similar question. We always place the median, the mean response in our surveys is 5.2 to 5.3. That's where Albertans place themselves on average. We do a follow-up question. Where would you place the typical Albertan? So not where do you place yourself, which is on average 5.2. Yeah. Where would you place the typical Albertan? It's always a full standard deviation to the right. 6, normally around 6. Yeah. It's that false sense of social reality that has been holding back left-wing parties in this province for decades, but it's coming out quite clearly in the research.
So the geeky survey researcher is going to come out here in my question, but I want to follow up on this sort of 5 as the average Albertan. Do you think that means that the average Albertan is centrist, or that the average Albertan isn't ideological?
Well, it as an identity, I think as an identity, or as Ken Bosenkohl has put it, a disposition, right? They are moderate and centrist. Moderate is actually the #1 identifier. 53% of Albertans identify with the concept of being a moderate. We do follow-up questions about policy, about values, and actually Albertans are more progressive than they are conservative on those things. Right, and they do align with where the median Canadian voter is on a lot of these things, but it's the identity of being a conservative, progressive, or a moderate that seems to be driving this. It's not ideology.
If I can just jump in with one thing, what's really interesting is we see this, centrism in the context of Alberta politics. But if you ask in the context of federal politics, so the Canada election study, what you see is that there is a more pronounced rightward skew in self-placement. So Albertans are inclined to see themselves as right of center in Canadian politics. And I think that has to do with one of those dimensions of Alberta politics, which is the relationship with the rest of Canada.
Yeah. So Les Sorensen has a question in the chat along those lines, asking whether or not the rural versus urban perspective is really warping self-identification as centrist and as progressive in the Albertan context. Jared's shaking his head no.
Well, this is why using left-right spectrums, you have to consider it as a relative tool, relative to where you see everybody else is usually what that tendency, and it's a tendency whether you're center or whether you see yourself as being extreme. So I could show you, if it was on my computer, I'm on a borrowed computer, I could show you a graph that shows that would layer where people in urban areas and where people in rural areas place themselves on that left-right spectrum. They're identical. There's a little bit of skewing to the right, but for the most part, people in rural areas still consider themselves to be centrist by that measure than they do consider themselves to be right-wing.
So I'll go back to some of Janet Brown's data. Pre-COVID, we did a deep dive in sort of the values of Albertans. And went beyond the political spectrum and started to ask questions about Ottawa, Alberta's relationship with Ottawa, treatment of women and minorities, Indigenous people, experts, and we didn't see any value difference between urban and rural Alberta. Today, post-COVID, we do. And I think there's more going on there that Lisa can probably tease out, but this rural urban divide didn't exist as much pre-COVID. And a good illustration, when the NDP formed government in 2015, they won 19 seats out of the major cities. This time, they may win 1 or 2 or 3, a very small number. They're clear, there's a partisan divide, but there's also a value divide that was either emerged out of or exploited during the COVID years.
So Daniela Bajones is asking, and it follows up a little bit on this, possibly follows up on the urban-rural distinction, is asking about prairie populism, and it's a theme that's come across in many of your remarks over the course of the last hour. What role does this sort of Albertan identity, whether it's the Wild West mentality that Jared mentioned, or sort of these more populist, libertarian ways of understanding oneself that might not be necessarily counter to progressive politics, but how do we see ideological shifts, or maybe we don't see ideological shifts in the Albertan electorate right now? How is that playing out in what we're seeing in this election? That's a big question.
Jared's the populist expert, so he should probably go first.
So we've thrown the question at you, Jared, and then I'm going to come back to you with Duane with a question about Janet Brown, since you've brought her up a few times here.
Yeah, so interestingly, going back to that question, we gave them a whole list, our response, a whole list of different political identities that they could identify with. Only 2% of Albertans identify primarily as populist. And I think there's only about 12%, if I'm remembering right, that even check that box to begin with, let alone have it be their primary identification. So there, you know, from an academic lens, we could look at what we're seeing and label some of this stuff as populist, as Ken and I have done some of the work that we've done. But from an on-the-ground perspective, I don't think Albertans are really used to applying that lens. It's either, you know, they use terms like grassroots, right? Which of these parties is more in touch with the average Albertan? And during this campaign, we've seen both parties try to make that case, right? Where the message, one of the key messages for the Democrat campaign is, we're focused on things that matter to you, right? That's been one of their key messages. And then the Conservatives, I think, are a bit coasting on their connection to the grassroots in that way. Although Danielle Smith did do a big photo op at the beginning of the campaign, or maybe just before it, about the grassroots guarantee on public health care, for example. So I would say populism is more of an academic exercise than it is part of the zeitgeist here in Alberta right now.
I think if we take the definition of populism as resentment of an external elite, then we start to see the ways that it infuses the conversation. So one of the things that we've heard from Danielle Smith and the Conservatives through the campaign is the idea that Rachel Notley, who on her own terms is kind of a left populist leader, right? I mean, it's her persona, but that she is being controlled by external elites, by Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau. This feeds into the sense of resentment of external forces that are creating these problems that, you know, that threaten the Alberta way of life. I think we also see it in Take Back Alberta, right? The resentment of the urban elite who've stolen Alberta away from, you know, the salt of the earth as they see themselves. And that was absolutely part of the conversation in the context of COVID, right? The idea of you know, deferring to experts. So it's absolutely there, even if people don't name it as such.
Do you think that reflects a polarization in the context of Alberta politics? Duane mentioned where people are placing these two parties as sort of relatively extreme in comparison to the median voter. Do you think this is something new that's being expressed with this resentment towards various forms of this elite, whether they're in ethnic or in urban or in federal?
The federalism piece is as old as Alberta, right? Like this is this, you know, it wouldn't be Alberta if you didn't have resentment of Ottawa. But in the internal context, I think it's something that's grown over time. And certainly as we see the breakdown no longer as being three regions in the province of Edmonton, Calgary, and rural, but rather urban and rural. And it coincides with the so-called diploma divide, right? One of the strong predictors of partisan support, if we look at the polls, is whether you have university education or not. This is, you know, increasingly driving some of the polarization and the notion of, you know, the educated elites in the cities who don't have common sense and so on. That's part of the tension.
So I'm going to take one more question from the audience. So Les Sorensen asked, says that they have relied on Janet Brown's polls as pretty accurate. Her poll that was leaked a week ago had the UCP leading handily. They found it interesting that she hadn't commented, at least not on Twitter, regarding the poll and the leak. Do you think it's accurate? And we got at this a little bit early on. Or is that poll really focused on a very specific audience that isn't representative? So I'll let maybe Duane jump in there
Yeah,
first.
I'll answer that
because
I had numerous conversations with Janet before it got leaked, because we knew it was going to get leaked because it showed good news for the UCP. So we actually had a bet about how quickly it would be leaked. This was not some sort of secret poll that she did for CBC that was never released. Conspiracies started to emerge out of that. Janet also runs a thing called Wild Ride, which is a subscription-based analysis that her and Paul McLaughlin, a political watcher in Alberta, do. And it includes polling that Janet does. And primarily audience are government relations firms. She presses send at 8:30 in the morning. One of the GR firms then leaks that to a member of the UCP, who then leaks that to Don Braid, the prominent columnist of the Calgary Herald, who then calls Janet Brown in the span of 35 minutes. What is interesting about her poll, and she's got another one in the field now, and it will get released probably Thursday or Friday, is it seemed to be opposite of a poll she did just before the writ period that focused on Calgary, where she showed the NDP ahead. So she was trying to explain what those gaps were. And one of the explanations was around education. And when they reweighted for education, the results actually started to look closer, because who tends to answer a long phone survey? More educated people. Janet is also renowned for being able to find the hidden conservatives that are not found on robodials or online panels. And that seems to be her secret sauce. But we'll have to see what the numbers come up with this week, because one of the weaknesses of her methodology of live telephone interviews is it's a long time window. And so she missed the Hitler poppy comments that other pollsters got, or it was just at the tail end. So let's see where her numbers come, but you know, she's been pretty accurate in the past.
Lisa or Jared?
I have decided, in the interest of my own mental health, if nothing else, that I'm going to stop paying close attention to the polls, because they're odd, right? There's this back and forth. There are questions of methodology. There's so much to guess here. And at the end of the day, I think one of the key questions is about turnout and who's actually going to show up to vote. And there's a couple of dimensions of that. First is, are traditional UCP supporters who find Danielle Smith and Take Back Alberta distasteful going to just sit on their hands and not vote? That's a it's possible, right? The other question is whether younger people are going to show up and vote. And we know that, the younger people are less likely to vote. We also know that they're more likely to support the NDP. So voter turnout, by age is going to matter tremendously. And it's going to be close enough that, these things are going to factor in. The polling tells us some stuff, but it doesn't tell us everything. And it's going to be a heck of a long week if you're desperately waiting for the next poll to come out and trying to believe it.
And we're also not quite sure what the get out the vote machines are like. And that's because despite the decades of Conservatives winning elections in Calgary, they didn't really have to try very hard. So how effective is their get out the vote effort? And the NDP has never had a strong presence in the city of Calgary. Now, it's almost like everybody has left Edmonton and moved down here for the last year. Is that going to make a difference? We did notice a huge show of power when within 24 hours of the writ being issued on May 1st, a sea of orange signs throughout most of the city. Is that indicative of the ground game the NDP has discovered? We'll have to see.
Yeah, well, I mean, Janet Brown's ears must be burning at this point, but I'll bring up another one of her comments. She's fond of talking about the two Calgary electorates that showed up or didn't show up in 2019. We had a federal election where the Conservatives swept just about every seat. I think they only picked up one or two. Is that right? Charles riding and just months later in a municipal election, we find that Conservatives sat on their hands, and we saw Joey Gondek, a very progressive mayor, sweep to victory over two fairly high-profile Conservatives in Davidson and Farkas. The big difference there wasn't that people changed their vote; it was that Conservatives just didn't show up. So the big question this time, to me, is: will Conservatives in Calgary show up?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here and ask one final question. So I'll give everybody a chance to answer. But if we think about what's at stake in this election, I hate getting asked who's going to win when I'm on one of these, so I'm not going to ask you that question. You're welcome. But based on what happens, should we expect any big shifts in what's going on in Alberta? So are their platforms really different? Are we going to see a different Alberta based on who wins? What's at stake here if we're looking towards the future to post-election?
The platforms are very similar. The question is, who do you trust to actually implement them? For example, Danielle Smith did have the big photo op about the public health guarantee, but Danielle Smith, for over 20 years, both as Wild Rose leader and as a newspaper columnist and a radio host, advocated for more private health care. So which Smith will enlarge? I think more significantly is there's a lot of pet projects that the UCP wants to do that they're not talking about right now. So far this afternoon, we haven't talked about the Canadian Pension Plan or the RCMP or the Sovereignty Act. I expect that those will all resurface with the UCP victory. If the NDP pull this out, unfortunately, I think there's going to be an element of UCP supporters that will not believe it, that will not trust it, that will start to mobilize against the NDP almost immediately. The NDP did not have good relations with rural Alberta in 2015 to 2019, and they had seats there. They're unlikely to have that many seats there, whether they win or lose. If you're thinking that the drama in Alberta will end on May 29th, I think it just begins. I think there might be less drama with a Notley victory than with a Smith victory, but there will still be a lot of drama in the province. So those would be my final words.
Yeah, Lisa?
I think the only safe prediction here is for more drama. I guess the one thing I would say, and this is coming very much from agreement with what Duane said, is that there has been a downplaying of a set of issues, particularly on the UCP side, which have everything to do with Alberta's relationship with the rest of Canada. And I anticipate if the UCP wins, they will link arms with Saskatchewan and, cause lots of consternation within the Canadian Federation. And as long as Trudeau is in power federally, it will be focused on questions around energy policy and climate change. There will be no end of conflict around that. And you can expect to see both these provinces essentially building up institutions that let them exist with less engagement with the rest of Canada. So it's pretty significant.
Yeah, I would agree on both those points. We know from history that when Alberta premiers are in trouble at home, they pick fights outside the province, and we expect that to continue. Honestly, no matter which woman is premier afterwards, I think Notley's got to prove that she's not a pushover when it comes to Trudeau, so she'll pick something strategically that she can take him on. And I think the only thing that at that point that would hold the Smith coalition together would be picking fights with Ottawa. So it's not likely to be a positive summer and coming years in intergovernmental relations. Just remind folks too that the Kenney government didn't really get into trouble with fulfilling stuff in their mandate. Their problem was that they were keeping promises they never made, right? So where they got into big trouble was when they proposed to strip mine the Rockies, redo social studies curriculum, a whole bunch of things that were never in their platform. So to the extent that Smith needs to come up with stuff outside of that document to keep her base happy, I think she'll run into all kinds of resistance here in Alberta. I'm with you. This isn't the begin, as Duane put it. This isn't the end, final chapter in this book. I think we're in a period of political culture shift. Lisa's written about this. I point everyone to her Substack where she writes about the two Albertas. This isn't going to be decided in this election. It's going to be a series of elections. And if we look back historically, probably this series started in 2012, where we had the Wild Rose versus the PC Vision, and we're still struggling as a province, again, to identify who it is that we think we are as a province, trying to reconcile that with who we are, and every election we have to decide who we want to be. But all three of those things are in constant conflict. For those of us that are paying attention to politics, we're going to be out in the field with focus groups this summer to figure out whether anybody else is even paying attention to any of this stuff. But stay tuned for that. Thanks for inviting all of us.
Great. So thank you all very much, Dr. Jared Wesley, Dr. Lisa Young, and Dr. Duane Bratt for joining us today. I've got all kinds of things that I'm going to be watching over the next week. And I also haven't looked at the data that Jared referred to, so I'll be interested to dive into that post-election. And to conclude, I'm just going to hand the speaker's role back over to Danielle Bélan, who is the director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. And before I do that, to thank him as well as the CSDC and CDM for organizing this panel and for our panelists for their willingness to share their insights and expertise with us today. Danielle?
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for really this interesting conversation. We are grateful to Frédéric for hosting this event with us, to Allison for leading this conversation. We are, of course, grateful to Duane, Lisa, and Jared for their insight about this exciting election. And also, of course, we thank those who took the time to join us today. Thank you also to our friends at the Consortium on Electoral Democracy and at the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship for co-organizing this event with MISC. To find out more about upcoming events next semester and to learn more about MISC, you can visit our website at mcgill.ca/MISC and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at MISCAN, MISCCAN. There's a newsletter sign-up link in the chat for you as well. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, and good luck to our friends in Alberta. We'll have the results next week, and it should be an exciting last stretch of the campaign. Take care. À la prochaine.